the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, which is the basis for the COP discussions, the Conference of Parties, is basically where this framework, which is a treaty, an attempt at a treaty, happens every year at the COP. The first one was in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit, which was, many of you will remember, and the COPs have been meeting annually since 1995. And so the entire system is based on intergovernment relationships. It's within the UN treaty system. That is the assumption that that can work. And I'm going to argue that it cannot work and try to demonstrate why I think it cannot work. Now, the UN system has charged the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, with providing the scientific information that is needed to discuss in the treaty to decide what should happen. Okay? So the IPCC, every 5 years or so, produces huge reports. Well, they're now well over 1,000 pages of reports on three things. How should society adapt? What do we do more to mitigate, that is, reduce the emissions? And what is the science of climate change? What do we understand about the actual scientific processes that are going on in the atmosphere and the oceans? And these are edited by governments. Here's the first clue that it cannot work, because these reports have people literally in the White House and elsewhere crossing out what they will not allow. So the scientific basis is immediately challenged by the politics of governments interfering in the process. Worse than that, fossil fuels are not mentioned in the discussions. At the last one, it was possible to bring in fossil fuels. The Brazil one was able to squeeze that in. But for 30 years, it has not been possible to actually mention the cause of the problem. And that, again, is a sign of what I'm going to talk about, which is corporate capture. This is the capture of governments by corporations which want to carry on burning fossil fuels. So we've already had 2 COPs which were hosted by what are generally known as petrostates. These are states, governments, where you could hardly draw a line between the industry of oil and gas and what the government represents. They are petrostates. Saudi Arabia would be another one. And we know that these states promote fossil fuels, but we've had 2 UN treaty meetings in those countries, giving them a voice and a chance to promote what they would like. And I would say I don't think the Conference of Parties system is capable of dealing with climate change because it is corrupted by the way in which businesses and some governments are able to control it. And these 2 recent ones were hosted by petrostates. Brazil hosted the last one with a lot of hope, but Brazil itself wants to expand oil production. It wants to join that group of countries in the global south who are wanting to do that. So we've had all of these COPs. This goes back to the original IPCC, and this is since 1950 with the increase in the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. Now, carbon dioxide is a tiny, tiny fraction of the atmosphere. I'm sure you all know that nitrogen is the main gas. 80% of the atmosphere is nitrogen, 20% is oxygen, and actually a bit less than 20%. And the other gases in the atmosphere are less than 5%. And carbon dioxide is much less than 5%. But that gas is what warms the atmosphere. If we had none at all, Earth would be a snowball. It's having some carbon dioxide that enables humanity and the biosphere to actually exist in the way it does. But because it has gone up, because of burning fossil fuels, we have far more. You can see there that it has gone up since 1960. I know it's very difficult to read, but it's 320 parts per million. We're now at 420 parts per million. So in that space of time, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has gone up more than 30%, unprecedented in geological and historical terms. And there are still huge subsidies going to fossil fuel, and banks and corporations investing in fossil fuel. I'm just going to give you a few of the recent headlines. So this is vast fossil fuel subsidies causing environmental havoc. Some of this data actually comes from the IMF, which is not regarded as a particularly radical organisation, but they reckon, the economists from the IMF reckon, that $5 trillion is spent by governments around the world to subsidise fossil fuels. So it's going to be tough getting to zero, but we need to go back. What are the ethics of these people? And why do they have different ethics? Are they ignoring the science? What is going on? Are they just uninterested in a world in which their grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and other people can live? So why is climate change done through the United Nations? A number of points. The Montreal Protocol, which you might remember as the treaty which controlled the use of CFCs, the gases that you find in refrigerators, air conditioners and so on, which were damaging the ozone layer. You all remember that, which was a major threat to humans and to plant life. That, in 1985, was regarded as a success. Now, the reason you could call it a success is because it worked. It reduced CFCs very quickly, and the argument I would make there, I'm not the only one who makes it, is that the industries had substitute chemicals available immediately. They could immediately switch to safe chemicals. It was no skin off their nose to substitute for a different way of doing refrigeration. And as such, we could say it worked because there was no corporate pushback on that treaty. The assumptions also in the early days of the COP system was that emissions would be reduced easily and adaptation would not even be necessary. In the 80s and 90s, it was thought that adaptation wouldn't be needed because human systems through the COP treaty would reduce emissions enough. Hasn't happened, as you've just seen. And it was understood that scientific work would guide governments in what was necessary to do. But we've seen that governments are not immune to pressure from corporations. And they will do what corporations want rather than what the science says we should do. What are the solutions then that come within the UN system? These solutions are, as I've mentioned, reducing the greenhouse gases. This began at the very start of the process of discussing climate change, and adaptation, preparing for it, which became significant only in 2005 when it was realised that the emissions were not going to come down nearly fast enough and people would have to adapt to a warmer climate. So why is the UN approach wrong? Where poverty already exists, where does it come from? It hasn't come from climate change. It's come from societies which allocate wealth and income unequally, grossly unequally. So my argument is that we should understand the relationships between elites and classes in their systems of power and not relations between countries. Relations between countries in the COP system is already failing. We've had 30 COPs. Why on earth do we need 30 COPs when we know exactly what has to be done? Okay? So that it's failing, and it's failing because power lies not with governments but with corporations and elites, and governments which are elite governments which are in hand in glove with corporations. Existing elites allow or actively cause there to be poverty and inequality. It's not an accident, not God didn't decide it, it's not random. Political and economic systems decide how much wealth is going to be distributed when it is created. So this is not the basis for dealing with climate change. How can this system be made into one that can deal with climate change? So I'm arguing that we should stop excusing those who cause poverty and problems for other people as an excuse why they should not fix and control it themselves. They use climate change as an excuse not to deal with what is causing poverty and inequality in the world. I'm going to stop there, a little bit over time. I'm sorry, I think we might still, I hope, have time for a few more questions. Thank you very much.